Hello. Thank you all for coming, and it's quite a rainy night tonight, so I'm excited to see you all here. Good evening. My name is Grace La. I'm chair of the Department of Architecture and principal of Dallman Architects. A quick reminder that we have live captioning available, and those joining virtually can enable the captions by clicking the icon at the bottom of your screen. And for our in-person audience, live captioning is available through the QR code currently on screen. And please visit the AV booth if you have any questions. I also want to invite you for upcoming public programs here at the GSD. First, we have a book talk with Jorge Silvetti, hosted by Sarah Whiting, Scott Cohen, and Erica Naginski, and that's in the Loeb Library at 2:30. And then tomorrow also we have a panel discussion, Public Art and Social Change, with the Boston Public Art Triennial. And then on Wednesday, October 22nd, Jeannie Gang and Elizabeth Cohen will celebrate Harvard Design Magazine 53, Reuse and Repair. For all the fall lineup, please visit the GSD website for upcoming events. So tonight, I'm really excited to gather you all for this year's Margaret McCurry Lecture in the Design Arts. And this lectureship was established in 2000 to honor Margaret McCurry and her longstanding service to the GSD and Harvard University. A native Chicagoan, this is ideal for us since we're celebrating the Chicago Architecture Biennial. Margaret McCurry is principal of the design firm Tigerman McCurry Architects, where my partner, James Dallman, worked with Stanley Tigerman years ago. So I'm especially and very personally appreciative that we would have this lectureship. The lectureship was established to invite design practitioners to share their work through the GSD. And again, so for many reasons, this is a very apt opportunity. So I'd like we have an unusual format tonight that we're testing. We haven't really done this, so it'll be, we'll see if it works, but we're excited about it. And this would not be possible without Florencia Rodriquez. So let me tell you a little bit about her. Florencia is an Argentinian architect, educator, editor, and cultural producer based between Buenos Aires and Chicago. She is the artistic director of the 6th Chicago Architecture Biennial, and this is titled Shift, Architecture in Times of Radical Change. She also is associate professor at the University of Illinois Chicago School of Architecture, where she served as director from 2022 to 2025. Florencia is also the founding principal of NES, an international platform dedicated to publishing, exhibitions, and consultancy in architecture and design. Florencia's career, marked by an entrepreneurial approach to cultural production, has bridged South and North America, creating and leading initiatives that expand architecture's public presence. She was a Loeb Fellow here at the Harvard GSD in 2014, so she is no stranger to us. Prior to that time, in 2010, Florencia founded Plot, which under her direction until 2017 became one of Latin America's leading architectural journals. With Pablo Gerson, she later transformed their Buenos Aires office into Monte, a semi-public venue for independent programming. And in 2017, co-founded Lots of Architecture, a US-based practice and publishing venture whose projects include NES and an ESS and a series of books on urban studies for the Inter-American Development Bank. At the UIC School of Architecture, Florencia has championed diversity of cultural perspectives, civic engagement, and critical discourse. Previously, she taught here at the GSD, as well as numerous South American institutions for nearly 2 decades. Her editorial and curatorial work have received many awards, and her writing has appeared in Log, Wallpaper, Domus, A+U, and many others. Her recent publications include America, Harvard Design Magazine, co-edited with Mark Lee, and MCHAP2, which is the Territorial Expeditions by IT Architecture Press. Forthcoming titles will include a catalog of Shift, of the Chicago Architecture Biennial, and Machado Silvetti drawings from 1975 to 1990. Many drawings which we saw in Jorge's 2022 exhibition here, and which he may actually reference tomorrow at tomorrow's 2:30 event. Florencia is also working on a collection of her most significant essays and conversations to be published by Park Books. Please join me in welcoming Florencia Rodriquez. Without whom this would not be possible.
Okay. Well, hi, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. And I want to begin, of course, by thanking Grace for the idea of bringing us together tonight to celebrate the hard work and the collective effort that this biennial represents for me personally and for the incredible group of GSD affiliates that are here today and gathered for this conversation. Since my time as a Loeb Fellow more than 10 years ago, the GSD has remained permanently as a place where I always find growth, inspiration, and friendship in the form of intellectual accomplices who, knowing so or not sometimes, always continue to challenge and support me. I also want to add special thanks to Sarah Rapson and Matt Smith for making this happen. I thought that the best way today to introduce here to Shift's spirit would be to share a few passages from the curatorial essay that I have been working on. This is an edited, shortened version for sure, but that captures the ideas and the questions that guided this edition of the biennial. So here we go. We live in one of those epochs of unease, periods when the urgency for change feels both inevitable and elusive. Architecture, in turn, appears blurred as a field, its boundaries uncertain, its definitions unsettled, but also open and bursting with potential reconfigurations of its body of knowledge, its reach and its capacity to act meaningfully in a rapidly transforming world. The discipline's substance and fundamentals are in flux, as are almost all layers of our existence. Many manifest quietly in gestures, in the ways people gather, in the subtle traces of daily life that resist being fully contained or codified. Shift begins precisely in such moments, when form dissolves into experience and the weight of tradition melts and instills into the urgencies of the present. This biennial is not a collection of answers or polished solutions, but of dispersed positions, fragments, suggestions, and experiments. Together, they sketch a field in which architecture doesn't necessarily claim new permanent canons, but offers a set of tools to read, question, and reimagine the world around us. Dispersion here is not the absence of meaning. It is the recognition that meaning today comes from pluralism, from context, and connections. Shift's scope is broad, yet it unfolds through specific and clearly defined lines of research and speculation. The obsolescence of the debate between autonomy and engagement, the emergence of new forms of realism, the resignification of vernacular knowledge across diverse contexts, explorations on the commons, the reflection on material culture, on what already exists and what we choose to build or to fabricate. The relation between form and experience, the reinvention of typologies, and the enduring shifting meaning or of beauty. Through these lenses, societal and political concerns are not addressed as external themes, but as conditions inherently manifested in the ways architecture operates and affects, in the spaces we project, and in the ways we inhabit. To curate the biennial today means to confront a cultural landscape that is saturated with events, publications, exhibitions, posts, and so many other media outlets. We felt that in such times of excess and deep polarization as well, the responsibility of curatorial work needs to provide conditions for encounters that are both critical and generous. Manfredo Tafuri once argued for the necessity of stepping slightly outside the torrents of one's own time in order to gain the clarity required for critique. That call feels extremely relevant today, in a world where transformation unfolds of an unprecedented speed and scale. To follow simple trends and to cling nostalgically to past moments of architectural brilliance seems insufficient and suspect, an abdication of responsibility at a time when revolt and disruption define so many aspects of our collective experience. But the strongest responses to revolt and disruption are not always necessarily loud or huge. They can also take the form of careful reflection on essential questions, operating firmly beneath the surface and transforming fundamentals. I trust discrete revolutions, the ones that begin from grounded and situated practices. This curatorial work is not about spasmodic or fashionable shifts that vanish with the next intellectual trend, but about sustained and deliberate transformations. This is a slow biennial, a space for softness, for care, analysis, manifestos, and the presentations of alternatives, a platform for dialogue and for the emergence, I hope, of long-term change. Mariano Ginás is a filmmaker from Argentina, who together with his group El Pampero Cine has built a cinematic universe grounded in narrative abundance and radical independence. Their films reject, in general, the industrial logic of production and instead embrace an almost artisanal mode of filmmaking that unfolds through collaboration, detail, and narrative excess, both literary and visual. Working in the margins of institutional frameworks, they construct vast and improbable stories with minimal resources, turning constraint into a form of freedom and celebrating cinema for sure. Historias Extraordinarias, Extraordinary Histories would be the translation from 2008, is perhaps their most emblematic work. And in that 4-hour-long film, organized into 18 episodes, fiction multiplies endlessly. A single narrative splinters into dozens of plots, voices, and digressions that coexist without hierarchy, yet within a precise and deliberate structure. The characters are called X, Z, and H, and a lot of the extra resides in the high density of the ordinary. As different critics have pointed out, the lightness, the usually irrelevant, the rediscovery of the anodyne landscape of the Buenos Aires province become the setting for transcendence. To watch Historias Extraordinarias, this movie, is to enter a different temporality altogether. One must prepare for it, devote almost half the day, and surrender to its rhythm. Immersion replaces consumption. Like Ginás' sprawling narratives, Shift intends to construct an open architecture of fragments and correspondences, a terrain where multiplicity is not a weakness, but a method. They propose that architecture, too, can suspend the demand for acceleration and instead cultivate long-form processes of invention, research, and resignification. This attitude becomes a mode of resistance. Architecture is inseparable from the conditions that produce it. It concentrates the labor, power structures, and symbolic exchanges of its time. Shift clearly resonates with contemporary ecological materialism in that sense, in the way it expands this view, situating architecture within a wider metabolism of matter and energy that binds the human and the non-human, the cultural and the planetary. Buildings are never inert. They are living assemblages of resources, desires, and contradictions that move across the different strata of our experience. To think materially today is to see architecture's agency in mediating these entanglements, revealing how the political, the cultural, and the ecological are intertwined in the making of our shared environment. In the images looping behind me, you can see a collection of comforters carrying personal stories and the intimate significance of the domestic sphere, images of fictionalized natures, the reinvention of parts of the city questioning the norm through the needs of disabled people, details of repairs to ordinary architecture taken out of context and exalted as fantastic sculptures, foundations exhibited, others for other formal signifiers carrying the trauma and rituals of a community of a certain area of the city, the charge value of the vernacular architecture like a granary or a simple roof from the Caribbean, loud reading as resistance and shared learning, breathing inflatable brick walls that collapse and erect in unpredictable cycles, reclaimed materials making new beautiful settings, design intelligence that is grounded in sustainable responsibility without resigning to form making, beauty, or an expression. All of those are parts of Shift and represent those complex sets of relations. To approach this, the biennial is organized in a series of autonomous and interdependent capsules. Rather than thematic compartments, they function as a constellation of open frameworks, overlapping in tone and sometimes in content. At the Chicago Cultural Center, the shift rooms on the 4th floor introduce the biennial's general themes and inquiries, and the capsule Inhabited Habit, a video installation that gathers 29 recent collective housing projects from across the world, proposing alternatives to conventional models. The Michigan Galleries host The Ordinary Extra, a capsule that explores the renewed attention from critics, academia, and practices to realism and the vernacular. At Graham Foundation, you can find fragmented manifestos, this is part of that, which playfully revisits the idea of the manifesto as a form of architectural expression and critique, and presents pieces that talk in different ways and moments. At the Stony Island Arts Bank, the capsule exhibition Melting Solids, inspired by Marshall Berman's All That Is Solid Melts into Air, works on the paradox between creation and destruction that defines the modern experience. In November, we will also occupy a vacant retail space at the North Michigan Avenue, hosting the Ecologist capsule, which expands the biennial's theme. Translating political ideas into architecture is always a challenge. Shift acknowledges that the most consequential positions are not imposed from outside the discipline, but emerge from within its own tools and practices. Research into new responses to the housing emergency, proposals for refugees, reflections grounded in ecological awareness, spaces that secure the commons, the use of reclaimed materials, and the commitment to reuse, repair, and restrain. All of these are profoundly political acts. They signal that the responsibility for change extends beyond architects to the industries, institutions, and developers that shape the built environment. Also, to find transcendent in the slow, the ordinary, and the collective, to value the weight of history, trauma, and context, to build with care and consciousness, to not give up beauty and magic, these are two political gestures. Thank you. So, right now, after that presentation of the general ideas, we will introduce our participants, our speakers tonight. I will not read their bios that are going to be there for the sake of time, so we can have a dynamic event. But as you know, we have this group of fantastic presenters. They are going to speak for 5 minutes each. We are going to keep it kind of in rhythm, and then we will take the stage and have a conversation related to that. And for sure, there will be questions by the audience. So first, I want to welcome to the stage Abigail Chang. Thank you, Abby.
Thank you, Florencia. Good evening, everyone. My name is Abigail Chang. I'm not sure if I should slide advance. And to give a little bit of background to start, my practice is interested in how material qualities, details, and framing devices can be used to subtly activate our built environment while responding to cultural currents that are happening all around us. And so for the Chicago Architecture Biennial, the project that I contributed is titled Liquid Glass. And this project considers how water has this invisible presence in air and vapor, but also how water can materialize and become visible as condensation across windows in our everyday lives. I began by reflecting on what would it mean to invert a typical building envelope, to collect rather than repel water from sweat and breath, or daily rituals like bathing, cooking, and cleaning. I was also interested in studying condensation through photography by documenting a chilled glass pane as it acclimated to room temperature, capturing these very brief moments before the water droplets completely evaporate and disappear from view. These photographs demonstrate how, when we witness this natural phenomenon, we are reminded of how architecture can produce these incredibly nuanced thresholds that both detach and separate, but also bring together our interior and exterior worlds, provoking and questioning our sense of awareness when these two contrasting thermal conditions collapse onto a single plane. As part of the research, I was also then interested in studying a material translation of this phenomenon, condensation, across windows, experimenting with lenses, glass, 3D printing, and casting to not only produce a watery surface, but to really think about how our perception is affected by condensation. And so the final prototype is made from a 3-step process where an initial object is made from hundreds of glass cabochons and paper laminated foam core, and they're used to create this negative mold from silicon, which is then finally poured with clear epoxy resin into these very shallow trays. And so the final result is a single cast resin object that reinterprets the condensation photographs I showed just a moment ago as a series of stills. Here, the pieces are photographed in front of a window during daylight. And so the work is currently exhibited at the Stony Island Arts Bank for the Chicago Architecture Biennial. It is alongside other large-scale works as part of the exhibition Melting Solids. And this installation reimagines condensation across windows as these panels that are hung from the gallery ceiling and seem to drip and float in space. Each of the panels measures 24 inches wide by 36 inches tall, dimensions that might recall a typical domestic window or a standard architectural drawing. And as you can see from the photographs, as a part of the casting process, the smoothness from the glass cabochons and the soft texture from the paper laminated foam core is imprinted onto the final pieces to create these varying translucent and transparent qualities that are both lucid and matte. These are qualities that I was also interested in interpreting graphically into the language for ephemera that accompanies the show in these small format booklets. And so the installation really encourages people to come in and move between the pieces in the gallery, to reflect on how fragile and ever-changing our environments might be. Bodies, light, movement really activate the pieces and create a blurry field that reminds us of how condensation really transforms windows from thin, transparent sheets to thickened, opaque screens, where water droplets emerge, multiply, invert, magnify, and really intensify the environment around us, creating a series of shifts that require visitors to pay very close attention to their surroundings. All right, our next speaker joining us is Iman Fayyad, who is an assistant professor of architecture at the GSD and founding director of a research practice, Project IF.
Thank you, Abigail. Thank you, Florencia and Grace, for organizing this. This project, entitled Thin Volumes in the Round, looks at the potentials of transforming material from thin planar sheets to volumetric form. Primarily, it's concerned with spatial exploration as a function of material waste. I want to begin first by thanking my invaluable project team who brought skill, dedication, and most importantly, joy to the weeks-long process of prototyping. Willie Unmahian, Claire Moreland, Howard Timlin, and Adrian Rucker. Scattered throughout this presentation are images of various tests and failures of scoring, soaking, steaming, bending, and stitching. The process of constructing this, the physical labor and intimate material experimentation, is for me much larger than the product itself, and what makes this project most relevant to the important conversations in this year's biennial. The installation is part of a larger line of my work that deals with the effects of standardization in building materials on architectural type. The work is invested in advancing the discipline of architectural geometry to reconcile the conflict between the ease with which complexity is achieved in digital processes and the financial, environmental, and ethical difficulties of their construction. The work showcases the development of geometric techniques that use standard, readily available, and affordable sheet material and produce little to no waste in their translation from flat to curved structural surface. Set dimensions of rectangular stock material are mapped onto curved geometries that respond to the scale of the human body, both in terms of their proportions and weight. They're just small and light enough to be lifted by 1 to 2 people, and in their resultant three-dimensional forms, which in this case is a structure that is larger than a piece of furniture, but smaller than a room. These forms are a direct index of structural, tectonic, and spatial desires pushing against constraints of economic forces that drive capital production, size of truck beds, material costs, labor practices, mass production, and so on. The trace of standardized material has textured architectural typology for a long time and across geographical regions. This indexing was particularly visible in the construction of homes in the US after the first 4 by 8 foot mass-produced sheet was introduced by the wholesale plywood industry in 1928. In the decade before the Second World War, the legibility of the 4 by 8 foot building block was associated with the idea of efficiency, cheapness, and material preservation. One such example is Eleanor Raymond's 1941 design for the Peabody Plywood House. She became a pioneer in demonstrating the waste-conscious benefits and spatial potentials of using full sheets of standard mass-produced plywood. Like Raymond, I'm interested in using the rectangular sheet not for rationalizing complex form, but generating it. Using a technique of curved crease folding, which I call sectional mirroring, the structure is composed exclusively of uncut 4 by 8 foot rectangular sheets of 3/16 inch plywood bent into composite cylindrical forms. Developable surfaces are split with planar conic sections, mirrored and rejoined. When unrolled, they preserve their original rectangular forms, but return to their flat state with newly inscribed hyperbolic curves. Each sheet is used in its entirety. It's simply scored halfway through along these curves and bent into shape, turning a thin, floppy rectangle into a rigid cylinder. 18 sheets are soaked in water, bent, and left to dry overnight. They're stitched together using backpack straps and buckles, requiring no adhesives, fasteners, or tools. This creates a modular system that can be stored, relocated, and reinstalled as needed. The closed radial form allows the membrane, a surface that is at once a wall and roof, to operate as a compressive structure in both plan and section, similar to a dome, while the oculus opens up the interior of the space to its surroundings above. The radial geometry and converging folds in each sheet create stiffness in the surfaces, eliminating the need for external structural framing. There's a beautiful imperfection to this process that I want to call out. This looks easy in the time lapses, but creasing sheets in this way is quite the workout, if I may say. It requires use of our entire bodies, pushing and pulling at things all at once. Opposing forces, concave and convex, hinge across a single curve. We often had to work together and against each other at the same time. But this relationship between the hand, body, and material was so important in designing a space that ultimately, in the end, really does exist at an intimate scale where the process is, hopefully, visible in the imperfections of the forms themselves. Seating elements on either side of the surface serve as anchor points for people to rest and gather. The interior offers a collective space that's inward-facing, while the exterior offers more individualized spaces that are simultaneously contemplative and exposed. The hope is that a deeper understanding and appetite for experimentation in simple, accessible materials and processes of architectural production can create new connections between the parallel labors of design and construction. And I also just want to thank Sarah Hanna, Victor Ohene, Shengyuan Liu, my brother for being the U-Haul co-pilot, the GSD Fab Lab staff and building services team, and the team at CAB and the Cultural Center for being such a joy to work with. So thank you all so much. And I have the pleasure of introducing next my colleague Jenny French, who's an assistant professor in the practice of architecture here at the Harvard GSD, and partner along with her sister Anda of French 2D in Boston.
Sorry, Grace, I didn't mean to trip over you. Thank you so much to Florencia, to Grace, to Sarah Rafson, and Matt Smith, always for keeping us on our toes. Okay, my timer is already going. So the contribution I'm sharing as part of this sort of Shift GSD family is a building, Bay State Co-Housing, and it's a project conceived of and developed by its 70 or so residents. The project's installed in the Inhabit Outhabit exhibition curated by Alexander Eisensmith, Magdalena Tagliabue, Camilo Restrepo Ochoa, Iko Comers-Wender, and Florencia Rodriquez. So it's a multi-channel video exhibition that's bringing together 29 housing projects from across the globe, assembling, quote, an atlas of projects that actively resist stereotypes. Featured here, functioning as dispatches, instructive examples for others, and contributions to a collective effort to radically rethink housing. So for myself and my partner, Anda, these dispatches for us are as much about the unusual road to design the project as the almost unbelievable fact that it exists at all. And what you're seeing are a set of images that toggle between artifacts created during the design process and images of the building just days before it was inhabited, spanning 7 years. So it is not a quick thing. It's a project really about how architecture can reorganize the conditions of domestic life, really a process and a build form. And really here it operates for us at multiple registers: the tangible building, the design of the process, policy intervention, but the sort of more slippery question of how architecture can help to sustain a community's evolving sense of comfort and belonging. And so from the first conversations that started in 2016, this developed not as a developers for profit commission, but as a self-organized effort among 30 households who wanted to live differently. So they became client, developers, and eventually residents. And our role as architects was really to design with them, translating at each turn, a set of values into built space and helping negotiate regulatory, economic, and policy things, frameworks that made it even possible. So over 7 years, these residents participated in visioning sessions, schematic design workshops, value engineering meetings, crisis meetings, emotional support meetings, workshops, all of which we kind of helped run and had clients moderate. And the project really is designed to construct, design to construction, weathered many shifting conditions, that 5-minute timer, Matt. This like Lemony Snicket's series of unfortunate events, right? When we started, a building moratorium and subsequent downzoning was happening in the town where it was located, just north of Boston. And we worked with the local city councilor to really advocate and actually then produce a new co-housing zoning ordinance. Construction began literally in February of 2020, and COVID and shutdowns and supply chains, created a whole host of delays and budgetary crises. So the result is a 30-unit housing complex organized around 5,000 square feet of shared space, common kitchens, gardens, terraces, and workshops. It's both compact and porous, and units interlock and stack around a partial open courtyard, producing, really importantly, reciprocal views and layered thresholds between public and private life. So corridors are almost entirely single-loaded, opening onto light and shared activity. Asymmetries in the courtyard allow visual and social awareness across units in circulation, so really the residents can encounter each other and always know who is home. From the street, importantly, the project is meant to read as sort of a large single house, familiar perhaps with the rambling Victorians just around it, but from within, the sort of singular image dissolves into a network of maybe more contingent parts. And is really then about the negotiation of these single units against a collective figure. So this building performs, 71% less than the average energy use, even before the solar panels that were just installed last year after the group funded them. And in this sense, the project is really, hopefully for us, in all these senses, not a prototype to be replicated wholesale, but really a dispatch from the field, a set of spatial and procedural lessons for others seeking to kind of shift, again, the terms of housing production. And really where I want to leave us is that, if the US's housing crisis is defined by profit and exclusion, this project, sort of operating still under those exact same economic constraints, is measured by pooled resources and inclusion. So And this is just a brief diagram of sort of the work of the last, 12 years that have led us here. Yeah, okay. And now, I have the immense pleasure of introducing probably my most referenced within studio former classmates and colleagues, Kwong and Alison von Glinow, who are partners in the Chicago-based architecture practice of their own name that transforms familiar elements into innovative yet accessible designs spanning homes, cultural spaces, workplaces, and public environments. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace. Thank you, Florencia. So for the 6th edition of the Chicago Architecture Biennial, both CAB 6 and the Harvard Design Magazine commissioned us to consider a new future for the Chicago Horizon Pavilion built for the inaugural biennial in 2015. So this is the Chicago Horizon Pavilion, which was designed originally by Ultramodern. The concept behind this original pavilion references Mies' experiments in flatness with the thinness of the CLT roof, emphasizing a new artificial horizon and providing shelter with a large canopy overlooking Lake Michigan. Having not been regularly sealed, however, existing conditions of the pavilion show natural decay of aging wood and water stains. So we considered the pavilion's future under this year's biennial theme of shift, as well as the magazine's terms of repair and reuse. We became interested in how decay can reveal itself through decomposition. The leaf here maintains its recognizable form and structure in spite of decomposition or the subtraction of material. So we studied the structural plan of the existing pavilion, which shows a plaid organization of 56-foot long by 8-foot wide CLT blanks and 13 columns, and the structural plan shows the clarity of its assembly and form. So we proposed to overlay a pattern of drilled holes in the shape of flowers to further reveal the original structure and bring a new and playful atmosphere to the pavilion interior. Abstracted from the structural plan, a field of flowers playfully articulates the structural properties of the roof. The areas without flowers are where there are columns or structural screws. We use a common CLT tool used for coring plumbing shafts. This is a Rothoblast LB hole cutter, which will drill 5.5-inch radius holes to form flower-shaped patterns into the CLT roof of the existing pavilion.
The flowers open range from a 3-petal to a 6-petal flower with only one lucky flower leaf cover. Our proposal name Forget-Me-Not reference the blue 5-petal flowers which have the greatest number of skylight in the pavilion. On a previous project for a residential art gallery, we core a large flower-shaped opening into a former bomb shelter to serve as a dramatic skylight in the immersive concrete rooms. We created one-to-one mock-up to study how the light and nature will enter the space. The roof mock-up enabled us to explore the identify the optimal size of each flower's opening and understanding the visibility of the CLT layer in the opening. Once cored, the diffused light of the flower-shaped skylight are projected into the pavilion and make for an evenly lit interior, like being under the canopy of a tree. Forget-Me-Not Pavilion, we used the ultra-modern original pavilion honor original design while creating a new interior experience under the thin canopy by reviewing the inherent structure. In addition, we introduced a new soft ground made of caulking cord. The pavilion added a new kiosk to bring a revenue to the park to help offset the maintenance costs. Movable furniture can be used flexibility under the canopy for the rest and relaxation. The light penetrate canopy offers a scenic passage through the heart of the downtown Chicago as a space for gathering to enjoy taking in views of the city and Lake Michigan. It makes for a comfortable space for moment of rest in the park to take in the surrounding site and grab a bite. Our cap installation of the project is located on the first floor of the Cultural Center in the section titled Ordinary Extra. There is a large 2.5-inch scale model showing the proposal with a rotating spotlight that casts flower pattern on the court floor. We had a great time visiting CAB and seeing all the speaker exhibition last week. Thank you.
And so we want to welcome the next speakers, Grace Law and James Dallman, who are co-founders of Law Dallman. Grace is professor and chair of architecture at the Harvard GSD, where James was a 2023 design critic in architecture.
You ready?
One mic, two people, very tall person too. Oh no. Okay. All right, timer starting. Okay, so these are not the gorgeous mill buildings that become fancy lofts. They do not fit into contemporary capitalistic regimes of adaptive reuse. They are disused, abandoned, demolished, and very ugly. They're the ugly ducklings. So this ugly duckling was condemned for demolition. Our colleague Timothy Hyde over at MIT reminds us that the role of aesthetic judgments are now entangled in wider assessments of art, science, religion, political economy, and the state. And faced with the unenthusiastic public, a local preservation group did what any good hoarder would do and squirreled it away, while asking their architect, what is its value to our community? How can you help us define this value? So one answer is sheer mass and material. 125,000 board feet of old-growth hemlock, 250,000 nails, weighing 250,000 pounds. A complex, spatially rich and robust structure veiled behind a mute facade. And what architectural language might emerge not from an additive assembly typical of contemporary construction, but rather through a surgical subtractive strategy like incising, embedding, resecting, splicing, and suturing. So this results in a shift that speaks to tailoring appropriation, aligning necessary work of repair with cultural history, craft, and social engagement. One could say that maintenance in this expanded mode is sexy. Hand-me-downs are also sexy. The building has been reclad in reclaimed corrugated steel panels from another granary that was torn down, and this brings a new favorable spin to wearing a dead man's clothes. So this phase of the project was completed late last year and also includes the ground floor space and a small wing for administrative and support spaces. We were able to take the entire structure and use the original repaired timber columns and introduce some shear walls, leaving openings for 15-foot tall double-hung windows. I think we may own the world's record on double-hungs. And in preparation for the next phase, we have been studying the incisions and insertions into existing cellular bin walls and how to float a floor to integrate light. So we actually used our CAB submission to test these ideas.
So the exhibit itself describes a 2/3 full-scale recombination of various components plus an exploded model of its entirety. We studied the extraction of material for its structural and constructional viability, both in form of the exhibit simulacrum itself, as well as the scale model of the entire project. The model helped us to understand it as a cultural artifact and to situate the life-scale composite into a miniaturized context of the building as a whole. Born on the 5th tray of Gund Hall, the baby was eventually swaddled for transport to Chicago, giving design discovery students a hint at what is expected of them in core. The storks delivering the baby to Chicago started out pretty perky, but adventures along the way took their toll, crossing Lake Michigan on a ferry, sunbathing, calisthenics, and gourmet meals in the parking lot. Meanwhile, our favorite craftsman, Mike Noss, was studying the drawings, and each piece was prefabricated in his Wisconsin shop and assembled on site in Chicago. Florencia has mentioned that we were building the building within the building. Started with a team of 2, eventually leading to 9 members of the team. Pretty much everyone pitched in, assembling 4 tons of material. The exhibition allows the visitor to shift in scales from the full building in model form to inhabiting the 2/3 scale, life scale installation. The exhibit explores key details and intersections and openings, which we learn from and have in fact affected our detailing of the final project. And I'm wondering here, why the hell did I do this? But the answer is obvious, because happy wife is a happy life. I want to thank Florencia and everyone on the team. We had an incredible group of participants. Thank you.
I'm glad he understands that. So next we have Alex Yueyan Lee. He is a co-principal of 11 by 17, an architecture practice based in Toronto and Denver. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you, Grace. James, that was wonderful. I love the idea of building in a building. I also want to thank Florencia for having us this year. It's really nice to be here. Shown here is our, what I'm going to talk about is our contribution to this year's CAB 6, titled Two Foundations. This project extends our ongoing interest in how buildings can be stabilized or reimagined by working directly with what already exists, both materially and procedurally. In our practice, we often return to a number of precedents that shape how we think about reuse and repair, one of which is exposing the foundation of the museum by Charles Burden, completed in 1987. What really fascinated us is its simplicity, a single cut into the ground, and for Burden, the act stabilized, the destabilized institution. But for us, it really reveals how spatiality can emerge from something as procedure as excavation. This relationship between procedure and spatial experience continues to be an interest within our practice. In response to this year's theme shift, we explored the very literal shifting of the ground, the slow settling, the movement that accompany any aging buildings. Digging, although it might seem undue stability, is often the first step within repair. To stabilize is to balance care and risk, precision and uncertainty. These logics of care, always near the edge of failure, shape how we engage what's already there. And I think in this project, the question of what's already there begins with a site, the Chicago Cultural Center. Unlike Burden, we were told that we couldn't turn the site into a construction site. Instead, we staged the construction within the constraint that we could only achieve dry assembly only. And I think that limitation became the project itself, really led us to think about the part-to-part relationship, how components could meet, align, and bear weight without permanence. And I think working at this one-to-one scale also meant negotiating directly between form, logistics, as well as assembly itself. What we are seeing here is the foundation number 1 underpinning, where it's a repair method of repair where new foundations are casted incrementally to stabilize what stands above. It rises 12 feet tall, built through layered laminations that links surface, structure, and formwork. We were also interested in how underpinning, usually hidden, could be brought into view, and how stability, is performed through sequence rather than assumed as a given. In Foundation 2, we are looking at the act of house lifting, which is temporarily jacking up a frame to insert new structure, to sneaking new structure underneath. We translate this into 3 stacked systems, ribbon cribs, needle beams, and an existing stick frame. Together, we consider them as a visual diagram of how load could transfer and trying to trace the movement, how that in itself becomes a structure. Across both foundations, we were also interested in investigating how the acts of repair, such as casting, lifting, layering, can themselves become spatial operations. What might seem purely technical starts to take on a formal and social dimensions. And planimetrically, through their accumulation of material parts, these structures start to make a room and inform certain ideas about how one might occupy the space. Here are our friends, Diego, using the room, quote-unquote room, to interview a few of the participants. And thank you so much. Next, I have the honor to introduce Chris Reed. Chris Reed is a founding director of Stas Landscape Urbanism, based in Boston and Los Angeles. He is also a professor in practice of landscape architecture here at the GSD.
Great, thank you. Thank you to Florencia and to Grace for including me. It's nice to be included in this group. Our contribution is a bit of a departure from what you've been seeing. Living Histories, Space for Reckoning is a rumination on questions of commemoration, remembrance, and the role of public space. It's a collaboration between Stas, Monica Ponce de Leon of MPDL Studio, and architecture critic Mark Lamster, who instigated the question of what to do with the current state of Dealey Plaza and Martyrs Park in Dallas, 2 spaces of commemoration that are heavily and negatively impacted by vehicular and rail infrastructure and intense traffic. The project poses a number of questions. How do we ensure that public spaces tell the complex and interconnected histories that have shaped our culture and inform who we are? How do we bring to light those stories that lie buried just beneath the surface of a society in ways that allow us to confront the harder and sometimes brutal realities of our entangled pasts? How is it that we might transform the recognition and commemoration of moments of civic, political, and racial violence in ways that allow us to reckon with these histories and set a foundation for conversation and for healing? No one knows what Monica was doing there. We still haven't figured that out. And how do we animate the people that embodied and lived our complex histories in ways that are honorific and continue to live on? This will require a new way of thinking about commemoration in public spaces, rather than focusing on a single person or a single moment in time, on grand gestures or static monuments. Public space has the capacity to record and trace the multiple lives and histories that have taken place and continue to take place in an unfolding series of stories. Public space should offer opportunities for interactions on people's own terms, a space for reflection and contemplation and reckoning, a space for discourse, for debate, for gathering, for remembrance, and even just for the simple and ordinary pleasures of everyday life. In public space, histories can be broadened and deepened, can be enlivened and honored, and can be written anew as part of the evolving life of the city. The proposed reimagining of Martyrs Park in Dealey Plaza weaves a reconsideration of the site of the assassination of President of the United States, John F. Kennedy, with a reframing and enhancement of the proposed Martyrs Park, site of the lynching of 3 innocent Black men, Patrick Jennings, Cato Miller, and Samuel Smith. In concert with the nearby Holocaust Museum and the city's judicial complex on the riverfront, these places highlight moments of intense racial and political violence in the city while honoring and celebrating the lives lost. The project features two key memorial elements: the Dealey Plaza Memorial Overlook, Amphitheater, and Connector to Martyrs Park. The Overlook and Amphitheater offer a space for reflection and orientation just behind and overlooking the place that President Kennedy was assassinated on 22nd November 1963. The wood deck rises up over the triple underpass to create a space to take in all of Dealey Plaza and to connect gracefully to Martyrs Park. And the second piece includes the memorial for the victims of racial violence at Martyrs Park, a project by Re-Site, Shane Albertron, and Norman Lee, with poet Tim Siebels. This part of the proposal commemorates racially motivated lynchings in Dallas from 1853 to 1920, including the 3 black men that were lynched on the 24th of July, 1860, along the banks of the Trinity River, which was originally located on this site. In so many ways in the project, new connections are made, roadways are shut down, civic space is given back to people, spray-painted X's in the road, X marks the spot, are replaced by bubbling water lenses at the 2 places where bullets hit the president. New living connections to the relocated river are established, all renewing and reimagining the urban realm, welcoming people in, offering multiple prompts and spaces for reflection, commemoration, and encounter. As Monica notes, commemoration in America shouldn't be based on grand gestures, but could be thought of as public space as providing the context for education. Over time, individually, and in the very personal ways that people will connect or reconnect to it. Thank you. And last but not least, I have the pleasure of introducing Oscar Zamora. Oscar is a Nicaraguan architect whose work spans research, design, and pedagogy, focusing on ecological and social resilience in the tropical regions of Latin America.
Thank you, Grace, for the kind invitation and the entire GSD team involved in organizing this panel. And finally, thank you, Flor, for inviting us to be part of the biennial and for your commitment to bringing visibility to regions and narratives that are often absent or late to the conversation. Oops. One second. Can I go back one slide? Red button. There you go. In exploring the shift in architecture, we focus on Central America's tropical context, a region often framed by ideas of wilderness and primitiveness, first solidified during the late 1800s when the United Fruit Company established its enclaves across the region. It was during that period that the first concept of a tropical hut was codified in the region as part of the architecture of the enclaves, which were these foreign-owned agricultural zones dedicated almost exclusively to the production and exportation of bananas. It was a hut that combined and adapted local building techniques to provide comfort for foreign workers who were really concerned about the heat, the rain, the insects, and the so-called lack of hygiene of the tropics. This created a shape in new cultural circulation of materials and a hybrid practice that would eventually influence modern tropical architecture in the region. This installation is the result of a long interest in the tropical roof, which is the fundamental archetype of the tropical imaginary. Beyond its technical role, it functions as a cultural and discursive tool, often revealing but also obscuring the histories of colonialism, extractivism, and the syncretism of materials. As climate change intensifies, bringing higher temperatures, humidity, and more violent storms, the urgency of these questions grows not just locally, but globally, as the global north begins to tropicalize and must turn to the global south for answers. This installation then suggests that architecture in the tropics not only has to face environmental pressures, but also needs to mediate social, cultural, and historical forces. This installation, perhaps in a very whimsical way, examines how architecture in the regions responds to these forces. As visitors enter the gallery, they are greeted by a gentle sound of rain and a floating structure that reinterprets the typical bananera roof. The installation juxtaposes a wooden structure with unfamiliar and foreign materials, like in this case, the mass-produced air vapor barrier shingles that create this pixelated roof cover. Through this mixture, the work questions how important technologies can acquire new meaning when reinterpreted, or, as is often the case in Latin America, through the intentional misuse as form of resistance. The installation then challenges the persistent framing of the tropical as primitive, revealing instead the complex entanglement between indigenous practices and foreign technologies, not as an act of imposition per se, but as a reflection of global material flows and hybrid practices. Rather than offering a nostalgic return or a technical response, the project then proposes a third space, one that embraces contradiction, improvisation, and critique. It reclaims the tropical roof as a site of cultural negotiation and imagination, inviting us to think about climate design not only through performance, but through meaning and history. Thank you. And I think now it's time for the participants to join the panel.
Okay. So first, I want to thank all of you, not only for your presentations today, but also for the generosity in all the process of making this biennial happen. All the conversations with each of you, the crazy amount of Zooms, yes, a day that will bring me to different locations in one morning, and to different worlds, you know, in the way that you were thinking about your projects was fantastic, and an interesting research experience as well. I couldn't stop thinking when you were showing the images of the travels to Chicago and the U-Hauls and the different teams to think about historias extraordinarias, the extraordinary histories that I was mentioning before, and all the kind of small things that were part of this biennial. Small for when you look at the big picture, but huge when we look at each of the stories there, right? So thank you all for that generosity that is also kind of a big part of making these collective efforts for culture to, you know, move forward. Right now, I prepare 3 questions only that I will ask to some of you, not everybody, because it's a huge panel, and if not, we'll have those uncomfortable moments in which nobody knows what to do with the question. But I wanted to go on 3 of the lines that are part of the research and the things that I mentioned earlier that are very present in your work. So the first question is to Iman, Alex, and Abby, and it's of course related to materiality in a way. So each of your projects approaches materials very differently, exploring their behavior, their limits, and their potential, and the ways you look at them also in some of the cases. So how do you see this kind of research influencing both the way we experience space and the way in which kind of building industry operates? So what do we need to do, or what do we need from industry to make that transformation possible?
I would say collaboration with the many actors who make the built environment come together. I think in my experience, what's interesting is we have these idealized, ideas as architects and as researchers about what the most efficient way to construct something is, what the cheapest way is, what the method is for, let's say, having the least amount of ground disturbance on a site, for example. And these ideas are all great in the lab, and they're all great theoretically, and they're great when we test them. But the reality is that's not how the trades that we collaborate with work as well. And advancements in various trades happen at various speeds. There's also I would say, a collaboration and respect of skilled trade or skilled labor in these various trades, from the designer to the contractor, and then the client. And so I think that what's interesting is that in a lot of the examples that we showed, I showed, there is a kind of idealized version, a sort of like an optimization in certain ways. But the reality is that there's no real, you can't sort of isolate independent variables and say this is super cheap and easy, because if it's very cheap and easy, it means that we can't hire skilled contractors to build it. But if we hire skilled contractors to build it, it's too expensive for a low-income community to be able to afford it. So there's always these sort of trade-offs, and I would say one thing that I have confronted a lot is how we might break down the barriers between what I sort of described as the parallel labors of design and construction.
I think to add to your comment about breaking barriers, I think generally the way that we think about architecture can really be quite an expensive term and to go beyond building industry. But I think this is where the platform of a biennial encourages visitors from so many different walks of life and other disciplines to kind of come in. And so I see that the material research is not, maybe it begins in a place that's quite speculative and experimental, but I think the hope is that it can also interpret the ways that we access information today. And maybe this is speaking a little bit closer to my research, but I think that it's not only about building and making things, but also about our perception of information and how we understand things today that materials can also translate through.
Right, yeah, absolutely. I think there's a concept that we always talk about in the way we approach project is the idea of material participants, which I think really resonate with maybe what you call collaboration. One fear that we have for every single project is from conceptual stage to DD to CD. The sort of the typical assumption is slowly reality starts to kick in. The notion of budget, the notion of labor, how can we find the right trades to build your building? I think a lot of times we have anxiety just to think about all these kinds of steps. One way we try to sort of reconceptualize is trying to revert that to say that, okay, the project will have a low budget to start with. Perhaps we won't be able to find the skilled labor. Then the question becomes, what do we do in that case? How does a design start to acknowledge these kinds of conditions that you will inevitably encounter in a later stage? So I think on the one hand, I agree that there needs to be a sort of rethinking in terms of how we talk to different collaborators. On the other hand, I think there are maybe a way to reconceptualize how we start a design even.
Thank you. I think there's a lot of overlaps that other people here could also answer to all the different questions, but I think that I will continue with the script, but I hope that the rest can join and jump in if you want to add something. So the next question is to Chris, Alison, and Lapchi, and Jenny also. Thinking a little bit about context, let's say. Each of your projects is deeply specific and rooted in context, yet and in different interpretations of context. So yet all share a drive for intentional reinvention, in a way. What role does history, and very recent history, in the case for sure of your project, play in that process? And how do the contexts you work with, and even the recent past then, shape the way you think and design for your cities?
I mean, for us, you could see it a little bit in the presentation. The histories are multiple, and the project's not so much just about looking back, but really beginning to kind of recontextualize, reframe some of those sites, some of those histories, and creating a new space, a new layer for new kinds of experiences, new histories to be born in many ways. We had to be quite sensitive in a lot of ways to particularly Dealey Plaza, which is a National Historic Site, so nothing technically can change. And yet in its current state, it's not particularly honorific about the events and tragedies that unfolded there. Never mind that the Martyrs Park is just completely isolated itself, surrounded by infrastructure. But you could see the way in some of those images that the site has continued to change, continued to be reinvented, continued to be reimagined over time. And I think our intent was to add yet another few layers to that, and to really give space back to people, to give space back to certain environmental forces that had once occupied that site but were erased, and to just provide space for quiet contemplation and reflection on some of what had happened there. So how can we amplify some of what was there, but do it in a new way that creates new experiences?
Hi. Yeah, I think for us, our history was very recent. Working with a beautiful, very strong architectural piece of work that had just not been cared for 10 years. And so for us, it was, when we started working with this piece of architecture, it was really a collaboration and almost like a marriage in a way. Aaron Forrest had said that when we started working with them to understand their drawings of the pavilion, because this wasn't a project saying that anything is wrong with their pavilion, but it had not been taken care of. And so then rather than just put on some new stain and sand off any graffiti, the point was to imagine a new life and reconsider it within today's context, now 10 years later, under repair and reuse, under the guise of shift. And so what we wanted to consider was just how can we amplify their pavilion even more for what they had created originally with their original kind of creating their structural system that was really quite innovative. And so we wanted to work with what they had developed and reveal their structure even more. So it's looking back, but also looking forward.
I might just jump in really briefly and talk a little bit about context as not always being about just the geography or the kinds of buildings you're surrounded by, but how a kind of collective or really a plural subject is created around any work, right? And depending on how many people feel that they are stakeholders, how actually an architectural artifact has to navigate the very actually difficult projection of so many various contradictory desires onto a single thing, right? And that things like is something historically sensitive enough, down to, just the inherent skepticism that I think comes from, necessary town planning meetings, et cetera, so that like hearts and minds have to be changed one person at a time. I think this question of once something gets into the territory of being more than for a single individual, then the construction of the narrative
is that much more entangled. And so I think everything you expressed in your essay is exactly that. There's no singular frame. It's actually like the success is, can all of these contradictory frames exist on a single artifact?
I like very much that you bring that into the reading, because the interpretation of the idea of context, I want to move it and displace it very much away from the idea of, I don't know, critical regionalism, or the idea of that direct contextual romanticizing thing of a past that we don't want also, right? So the idea of context that I want to bring is more complex and in that relation, and I'm happy that I think that bridges perfectly to the next question, that is to Grace, James, and Oscar to hear, because for sure the questions about the ordinary, the vernacular, and some of the things that we have been talking are present in very different ways in both your projects. And connecting material culture with context, labor, local idiosyncrasies, and history also in both, and different histories. So how do you see architecture mediating among all those forces? You responded in part to that, but I would like to understand also what kinds of tools or strategies do we have or should we have as designers to do so, to work on that mediation?
Just going to react. This idea of mediation, it's interesting, and it's also important to me. And it's funny that you mentioned the critical regionalism, because I mean, mediation in a way is a reaction to what I find very problematic in critical regionalism. And this is a conversation we've had many times with you, Flor. And to me, it's critical regionalism. It's all about tends to polarize, to amplify the extremes. You have one side, the universal versus the singular. You have the technological versus the primitive, the modern versus the vernacular, and so on. And right now, this idea of mediation is putting architecture right in the middle of it to negotiate. So just trying to respond to your question, I think in order to have let's say a successful or responsible mediation, it's important to have a tactical or an intentional reciprocity in terms of process, in terms of reciprocity of knowledge, of participation, of narratives, and I think reciprocity by concept means that there's no hierarchies, and then there's no dominant narrative, which is super tricky. It's complicated because I mean, if we think about all the systemic issues throughout all the history of architecture, but I think ideally it's possible, perhaps through a mutual recognition of all the different narratives, all the different in framing this in the context of our project, the different local technologies, foreign technologies, but also understanding the different layers of history and acknowledging the histories that we know, but also those histories that have been obscured. And I think then maybe I'm not going to offer tools to, but maybe I see opportunities in this intersection of narrative, of regions. It's going to naturally, I think, create some sort of tension, friction, and I think that's there's the richness there, and the result of that friction is going to be a misinterpretation, a misreading, or a reinterpretation, or rereading of all these a narrative, and I think that's where the opportunity for new architectures and narratives lie. I don't know. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Well, that's a big question, Florencia. I wonder if one of the things that happened with the Granary project is that really, it was a very real moment that the public really wanted to just destroy this thing, this artifact of agricultural infrastructure, again, because it has no immediate commercial viability. Again, it's not the mill building that turns into the lofts that developers love. So I do think that the architect specifically has a voice here because there's the potential to define a certain kind of value, which I think is pretty interesting. Now, we had an exhibition here that Farshid curated on drawings. When was it? Several months ago. And all of the drawings, I would say 99.9% of those drawings were describing additive assemblies where there's certain layers assumed of construction, and actually our drawing in that grouping didn't fit because ours was about the existing thing and the subtractive nature of it, so we couldn't actually conflate all the layers of the drawing onto one drawing. So that to me really represented an enormous blind spot in the way that we're thinking about the drawing as a medium to convey what needs to, a kind of method of or thinking or working, way of working that just is not captured by contemporary construction techniques. So I thought that it was for me an interesting moment. I was so embarrassed. At first I thought, oh my God, we really didn't understand the brief here because we had the one drawing that really stuck out like a sore thumb. But then it also got me thinking that maybe it's because we were so focused on the building of new buildings that brief didn't work for something that was really, really considered to be not valuable and not worthy of any attention.
Just in terms of the reciprocity, I think just in terms of that extractive nature of the project, there was a freedom to not have to be about the form, not to have to be talking about what should this look like. It was already present in the community. It was derided. It was not loved. It was thought of as a blank, hulking mass that housed pigeons and some refuse. And so it was really a question of kind of trying to disassemble the public preconceptions about what the building was for the community and try to talk to people, understand what that agrarian history was, what the relationship was with the economy, the local craft, to try to unearth something about the project that was not present to the public, but nor was it imposed on it as a form-making strategy that the architect brought to the table. It was more, how do we extract something from this mass of material on the site that, for the community up until that point, didn't carry much meaning, to how to release that meaning for them.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there are so many words of resignification of, the question of meaning in some of these projects and some reinvention, as I was mentioning before. So thank you. I know we don't have much time, and I want to reserve these minutes to open the possibility of questions from the audience. So I'm not sure if there are any questions.
I guess my question sort of builds on, Grace, you were talking about sort of representation, because while all of your work is very different, all of you take, these traditional modes of architectural representation, like models, drawings, full-scale mock-ups, and even like, a full building in Jenny's case, and sort of put a creative spin on them through, models hanging on models, layered drawings, sort of. Iman, you were playing with scale. So I was wondering, if you could talk a little about sort of how you think about each of these projects as a different mode of representation, or how they sort of interact with the public and how, they could be seen through that lens.
Well, I would say that one of the things that was very interesting is to revisit the Beaux-Arts tradition of the analytique, in which, let's say, different moments are compressed into a single drawing. And for us, the installation was a three-dimensional analytique. And that was very interesting for us to try to figure out all the different details, but then implode it somehow and make it into one thing. But I do think that all of the projects, if I may, have tried to lean into some aspect of what we produce and the language that we are drawn to critique something of the, again, whether it's the history or the site. And I find that to be very inspiring. I mean, I'm seeing some of the most beautiful drawings that I've seen in a long time from this group, so I'm really impressed with that.
Anyone else?
As your representation course instructor, I'm very proud of your question. That's all I'll say. Next question.
I think there was another question over there.
I think this question is for you, Florencia. After seeing some of the Biennale participants from the GSD, there are others that we didn't see that stayed in Chicago, I guess, or elsewhere. What were some novel insights or surprising, unexpected insights from all the projects that you saw or that you witnessed that you weren't expecting when you proposed this year's this Biennale's topic?
Yeah, the amount of inflatables. Yeah, of course, when you start inviting, and I have been in publishing and doing some curatorial work in a way all the time, all of my life, I already had kind of a certain wish list or not wish list, but the idea of, trying to find a balance in between generations and between people that have already been in certain specific events like this, but a big amount of people that were exhibiting for the first time. And I was trying to open all the lines of research that I was doing and bring people that would respond to that. And some people were already working with air or with earth and soil, but I couldn't believe the amount of proposals in the first round of conversations that came with proposals about air and soil. And that was, the inflatable thing was quite interesting. And I wasn't talking about that with a lot of people, only kind of my closest team. And I had the first meeting with the graphic designers, and they bring me a shift that is all inflatable. I told them no. Okay. So, but I think that's interesting to understand. That every solid melts in the air. So that's kind of a very literal kind of translation to some line of thinking. But why in this crazy moment that we are living, so many projects are about something that can transform, that is slight, that is not permanent. And that was for sure a huge surprise. Some of them you can see in the exhibition, and some others didn't make it through, but there were too many inflatables. Yes. Also, I think that maybe we can close it here. Thank you again so much for hosting this and for your project. Thank you.